Welcome back to Dentro la Storia, the channel for those who love contemporary history. As you know, we've decided to devote this month, April 2026, to the War of Liberation, especially its final chapter, April 1945, and what happened 81 years ago. We started the month with a video dedicated to the last year or so of Mussolini's life. Then we focused on the Italian Social Republic, on its origins, its nature, its peculiarities, its end. Today we come to a topic that will certainly be much debated even among you who follow us. Actually, can the War of Liberation from September 8, 1943 to April 25, 1945 be defined as a civil war? Today this video also wraps up another mini-series we've been working on months ago, which was precisely about the question of whether it was a civil war or not within Nazi-occupied Europe, with the various collaborationist movements, with the various puppet states. And we come to a conclusion. When do we talk about civil war? Let's start by setting these boundaries, just to understand the context we're dealing with. So, we talk about civil war when two internal factions within the same state compete for legitimate power. Imagine any democracy where a political faction decides to take up arms to overthrow the current government by force without going through democratic means. It's clear that within a civil war, two or more governments are formed. All sides claim legitimacy, but first and foremost, they have political and military autonomy. The conflict, is mainly internal. Sometimes there can also be a small foreign intervention, as happened in the Spanish Civil War. But the control of the troops and the ability to act in the field, starting with the general strategy, is exclusively their responsibility. To the internal party involved, the key point of all this is autonomy and legitimacy of the parties in conflict. If we look at all of human history, we have many examples of civil war. Think about the civil war in ancient Rome. When Gaius Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon with his army, he opened a small but bloody chapter in late Republican history, in which he and Gnaeus Pompey faced each other with weapons in hand. It's not the only example. Think about the American Civil War, also known as the Civil War. In that case, a portion of the states of the United States of America decided to secede, that is, to leave the Union, for political and sociological reasons, and also because of differences in approach. This led to a heavy conflict with consequences and scars within American society. Scars that would be healed more than a century later, but in some ways are still visible today. That too is a classic example. We can also talk about civil war within the Russian Revolution. The war between the Reds and the Whites, between the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks, is another example of this. Even though there was some foreign intervention there as well, with a few expeditionary forces and funding provided by the Entente powers to the Mensheviks. But even in that case, the strategic choices made by the commanders on both sides were completely independent. Finally, as we've already mentioned, the Spanish Civil War, which broke out in July 1936, lasted almost 3 years and saw the legitimate Republican government facing the uprising, the pronunciamiento of the generals, the nationalists. There too, there was foreign intervention from both sides. The nationalists were supported by right-wing totalitarian regimes, specifically Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, plus a small Irish contingent in the support of Salazar's Portugal. On the other side, there was Soviet intervention through weapons, ammunition, military advisors, and the phenomenon of the international brigades. The fact remains that the Spanish Civil War was indeed a civil war, since both sides in the conflict were not under direct control or control exercised by foreign actors. What always matters is the autonomy and legitimacy of both sides. Why this preamble? Because we need to understand what happened in Italy. After September 8, 1943, when the EIAR, the radio broadcasting agency, aired Marshal Badoglio's proclamation announcing the short-form armistice of Cassabili in the evening, Italy was split. Worse, Italy was occupied. Nazi Germany, which had already prepared an occupation plan after Mussolini's fall on July 25, 1943, put its plans into action and within a few days occupied most of the country. But this doesn't mean that the Italian government disappears or no longer exists, or that there is no Italian state. What would later be called the Kingdom of the South informally is the direct continuation of the Kingdom of Italy, with the government moving to Apulia. It's nothing more than an attempt by the monarch, that is, Vittorio Emanuele III, and the Badoglio cabinet to continue the perpetuation of Roman power. What do we have on the other side? At least until the end of September 1943, nothing, only the German occupation. But something changes with the birth, as we saw in the previous video, of the Italian Social Republic with Benito Mussolini installed at its head, but we saw that just a few days ago. The RSI is not a sovereign state. It is not a state that was born spontaneously. It is not an attempt carried out independently by the old fascist party to make a comeback, with weapons in hand to claim legitimacy and above all power over the state. The RSI is nothing more than a puppet state under German control. It depends militarily on the German armed forces. The fundamental political decisions are subordinate to Germany's wishes. The territory itself is not under the direct control of the RSI. In fact, part of the Italian territory is even ceded to Germany. Think of Friuli, Venezia Giulia, Istria, Belluno, Trentino, and Alto Adige. These are all areas that are annexed to the German Reich. So the RSI has no autonomy, no ability to present itself as a legitimate and independent state. Within the RSI, in the territory nominally under the RSI but actually occupied by the Germans, the partisan movement develops, a very heterogeneous movement made up of groups that answer to different parties, to different commanders operating in very different territories, but it is a movement with a clear objective. Through the fight against the foreign occupier and its puppets, that is, the RSI, it seeks to reestablish a free and independent Italian state. In this, the partisan movement naturally connects to the legitimate government of the so-called Kingdom of the South and to the allies who have already landed, first in Sicily, already in the previous summer, then later from the rest of the peninsula, moving northward to support the liberation. That's exactly why it's called a war of liberation. These are typical distinctive features. If it had been a civil war, we wouldn't have seen the birth of the RSI subordinated to Hitler's wishes. We wouldn't have seen something non-existent arise, only thanks to the will of a foreign dictator. And we probably wouldn't have even seen the partisan movement. It's true that within the armed forces, Italians fought other Italians within the RSI. But how did things really go? The Repubblichini, as the soldiers of the Italian Social Republic are informally called, operated within a system of foreign occupation. Among other things, they never operated on the front lines, but only in operations behind the lines, such as roundups, police actions, reprisals, and repression. The Repubblichini were formally subordinate to German interests. They had no autonomy whatsoever, not even in purely military matters, or in their freedom to maneuver. So how can you define it as a clash between two equivalent Italies? The Kingdom of the South, starting from the end of 1943, began to reorganize autonomous armed forces, although these too had secondary roles, and were based on the old units. Those units that managed to escape capture, destruction, or disarmament by partisans or Germans, and that were rearmed mainly with American or British equipment, and that contributed in a secondary way to the liberation. We can't talk about a clash between two equivalent Italies if that were the case. The fascist Republican forces and those of the Kingdom of the South would have faced each other, at least on one occasion, in open field, in a pitched battle. That was not the case, unlike, for example, the Spanish Civil War, in which Republicans and nationalists faced and fought each other on several occasions, sometimes even with the direct involvement of foreign powers. But mainly, clashes occurred between Republicans and nationalists Here, instead, the clashes are marginal. They happen in the rear. The fascist Republican forces act only against the guerrillas, the partisans, who are not regular troops, even though they were later assimilated into regular troops. There can't be a real civil war if one of the two sides isn't sovereign, but is completely dependent on an occupying power. In other words, how can you call it a civil war if one of the two warring states isn't legitimate, wasn't born spontaneously, isn't autonomous, isn't able to maintain its own existence, and isn't even able to maintain a minimum of territorial integrity? How can you talk about a civil war if part of the country involved in this supposed civil war is occupied by an extraordinary government, by a foreign power with its own armed forces, against which the citizens take up arms to rebel? These are principles, basic questions in our reasoning. It must be said that some historians, over the years, have almost tried to rewrite the history of the War of Liberation, talking about a civil war, asserting a sort of triple dimension of the conflict. There is a patriotic war against Nazism, a class war, meaning a social and political dimension, and finally the civil war between Italians, simply referring to the clashes between partisans and fascist Republican troops. But all this is not sustainable at all, because one principle is missing: the principle of autonomy on the part of the RSI. The resistance, for example, even though it was fragmented, even though it was organized into groups that were very distant from each other, both geographically and on a cultural and political level, enjoyed moral as well as political legitimacy. In fact, the resistance had official backing for armed struggle that was also guaranteed by the Kingdom of the South. Many partisan commanders were former officers of the Kingdom of Italy, of the Royal Army, while other partisan commanders had been politicians before fascism or had operated underground during fascism. This shows how, in fact, partisan groups, although theoretically irregular, had their own dignity and autonomy, something that the fascist Republican forces did not have. The conflict cannot be defined as, if you'll pardon the expression, between brothers on equal terms. There is another aspect to consider. The recruitment of the fighting forces was very different. Partisan recruitment was essentially voluntary. The partisans never called for conscription, also because they couldn't. People went to fight with the partisans because they believed in a cause. The Kingdom of the South, with its own legitimacy, with its own autonomous government, in addition to international recognition, also had the ability to call people to arms independently. The fascist Republican forces, on the other hand, are essentially based on three different factors. The first factor is the ideological factor. Some of the members, mainly the Black Brigades, are fascists. They are the heirs, or the remnants, from the militia formations, which had been the armed wing of the fascist party during the 20-year fascist regime. Other formations are forcibly recruited. Several call-up notices were issued, threatening execution for anyone who failed to report. All this shows how truly spontaneous enlistment in the fascist Republican armed forces was minimal, marginal. There is a third topic to address, that of the IMIs, Italian military internees. Those hundreds of thousands of soldiers captured by the Germans, disarmed by the Germans, and deported to Germany, to prison camps. Several officers who had decided to side with Mussolini, or in any case with the Germans, went around the prison camps to convince the troops imprisoned there to go fight again for Mussolini. The response, as we've already seen several times, was practically unanimous. I find very few who were attracted more by the promises of freedom, better food compared to what they had in captivity, and the chance to wear a uniform again. As we were saying, the overwhelming majority said no. They put up a passive, silent, and firm resistance against a puppet state like the RSI, thus declaring themselves still subjects of the Kingdom of Italy. Prisoners of war held by the Germans, but still belonging to the armed forces of the Kingdom of Italy. And so they were taking sides not in a civil war, but in the Second World War. They therefore did not recognize the legitimacy of the RSI as an authentic government to which they should swear allegiance, and for which they should fight and possibly die. The reaction of the IMIs should make it clear that it was not a real civil war. Then there's also the issue of the 29th Waffen SS Division, formerly the Italian SS Legion, a combat unit that was recruited simply for money and that had, in a strange case, an enormous number of non-commissioned officers and a proportionally small number of troops, simply due to the disparity in salaries. The officer's salary was much more advantageous, which is why within the Italian SS Legion there were many more officers than troops, because being recruited on the strength of an educational qualification or military experience made it possible to rise quickly through the ranks. Basically, the Italian SS Legion, later the 29th Waffen SS Division, was nothing more than a mercenary army. So we come to our conclusion. We have seen other examples in the previous episodes of the mini-series we called Civil War. In France, after the 1940 armistice, Vichy emerged, the État français, the French state, the state led by Marshal Pétain. But at the same time, de Gaulle's Free France had also emerged, and yet in France, despite this confrontation being intense and heated for over 2 years, and then continuing even further, despite the inglorious end of Vichy, until 1944, no one in France spoke of civil war. Why is that? I'll let you imagine. Because no one recognized any real international legitimacy and any real autonomy to the Vichy regime, which was basically submissive and subordinate to Berlin's wishes. We saw the case of the former Yugoslavia, which broke up into many different factions. The Ustashas and the Domobranci sided with the Nazis, Tito's partisan formations, but also the Chetnik formations of General Mihailovich. What might seem like a picture of civil war is actually more an ethnic and ideological war. But even today, in none of the states of the former Yugoslavia is the principle of civil war invoked for what happened between 1941 and 1945. And there must be a reason for that. We have seen examples in Northern Europe and Denmark where the Danish government also formally remained in office for a long time, with even the ambassador in Washington disobeying orders, handing over Greenland and Iceland for a certain period to the American administration. Or the Norwegian example, the quintessential collaborator, Vidkun Quisling, a name that has become a symbol of collaborationism. And yet even in that case, Norwegians do not speak of civil war, despite Quisling being supported by his legions of loyalists, and despite some Norwegians siding with the German invaders. But we could talk about it further, mentioning Léon de Grelle in Belgium, or the Flemish Legion, or even the collaborators in the Soviet Union, in the Baltic states, in Ukraine. We could even talk about Monsignor Josef Tiso, the Catholic priest who was made head of the first Nazi puppet state, Slovakia. In none of these cases is there talk of civil war. So why in Italy for a long time, and even today, do we hear this term civil war? It's simply an attempt to put on the same level those who fought for freedom, suffered for freedom, and died for freedom. Those who even accepted the harsh imprisonment in German camps for freedom, with those few who, for different interests, followed a puppet regime. They try to put very different situations on the same level, but if you look closely, by observing history very carefully, in all its details and facets, you realize that it wasn't a real civil war. Shall we summarize the reasons? First of all, the decisive factor was a foreign occupation. There was no armed attempt by the Fascist Party to overthrow the government. If the RSI had arisen after July 25, 1943, independently, trying to immediately free Mussolini, who had been deposed, triggering an internal conflict within the Kingdom of Italy, then we could have talked, yes, about a civil war. But that was not the case. Then, as we said, the RSI was not an independent entity. It wasn't in any way. It was always subordinate to the Germans, whether for strictly military reasons, political reasons, or even economic and diplomatic reasons. There was no margin for autonomy. Finally, the conflict between the parties. It did not assume that RSI wanted to take over the entire national territory and shape it as it pleased. Also, because part of the national territory was either controlled by the Allies or, worse, had been handed over by R6 to full 100% German control. It was just a struggle for survival for R6 as a puppet state. The real objective for the Southern Kingdom, the Partisans, and the Allies was national liberation. So today, even though there are still some people who repeat the story of the Civil War, but only simply to try to support a shaky thesis, the simple fact that some Italians fought against other Italians is not enough to define what happened between September 8, 1943 and April 25, 1945 as a civil war. It was a war of liberation. A war of liberation from an occupier who had chosen to surround himself, to be accompanied by local lackeys who were not free. They were simply slaves to circumstances and to the occupier himself. There was no autonomy. There was no real civil war. There wasn't one. And you can't talk about a civil war no matter what. I know there will always be someone who tries to deny the evidence and bring up opposing arguments and discussions. Do you want to try? Go ahead. We could even discuss it. Why not? The fact is that today I have given you some elements, clear elements, irrefutable elements, about why we can't talk about a civil war. For today, we'll stop here. But our mini-series dedicated to the liberation isn't over. In a few days, we'll tackle another topic, a topic related to the birth of the Republic. But no, we won't talk about the June 2nd, 1946 referendum. We'll talk about an event that laid the foundations for a democratic Italy, for the return of democracy in our country. Maybe you've already guessed, but I won't say anything else. See you in the next episode of our mini-series.